The gavel struck the table like a gunshot, and Elena Whitmore felt her whole body flinch. She stood on a raised wooden platform inside a private hall she had never seen before, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. Around her, men in dark coats sat in rows of polished chairs, their eyes moving over her the way a buyer studies a horse before a race. Some held small paddles, others simply raised 2 fingers when they wished to bid. Every one of them looked at her like she was an object to be measured, weighed, and claimed. She was not an object. She was 22 years old. She had a name. She had a mother who had died only 3 weeks earlier, leaving behind grief so heavy that Elena still forgot, some mornings, that she was truly gone. But grief was a luxury she was no longer allowed to have, because along with the loss of her mother, Elena had inherited something far more dangerous. A debt. A debt so large that it had swallowed the family house, the small orchard behind it, and every coin that had once given her a sense of safety. And now, according to a contract she had never signed, and never even known existed until 4 days ago, that debt could only be settled one way. Her. The man responsible for reading the terms of that contract stood beside the platform, a narrow figure in a gray coat with small round glasses perched on his nose. His name was Josiah Pratt, and his voice was calm in a way that made Elena's stomach twist every time he spoke. The young woman comes with a modest dowry of household linens, a set of silver candlesticks, and full legal transfer of the Whitmore family debt to the winning bidder, Pratt announced, his tone as flat as if he were reading a grocery list. Bidding will open at £400. Elena wanted to scream. She wanted to run from the platform, push through the crowd, and disappear into the streets outside where ordinary people walked freely, unaware that rooms like this even existed. But 2 large men stood near the exits, hired by Pratt to make sure nothing so inconvenient happened. She had learned that lesson the day before when she tried to leave the townhouse where she had been kept since her mother's funeral, and one of them had simply stepped in front of the door without a word. So she stood still. She lifted her chin, because if she was going to be sold like livestock, she refused to let these men see her cry. A paddle rose near the back of the room. 400, a voice called. Another paddle. 450. The numbers climbed. Elena tried not to look at any of the men bidding on her, but her eyes kept drifting toward one in particular, a broad, red-faced merchant named Holloway who sat in the front row with his arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on his face, as though he had already decided the outcome before the bidding even began. He had money. Everyone in the room seemed to know it, and he kept raising his paddle every time someone tried to challenge him, almost lazily, as if he found the whole process entertaining. 600, Holloway called, not even bothering to raise his paddle this time, just lifting 2 fingers with a bored expression. The room fell quiet. No one else moved. Pratt smiled thinly. 600, going once. Elena felt her heart drop into her stomach. She thought of her mother's soft voice reading to her as a child, of the garden behind their old house, of every ordinary, happy memory that now felt like it belonged to a different life entirely. She thought about what it would mean to leave this room on Holloway's arm, bound to a man she had never spoken to, whose reputation among the servants who whispered in corners was not a kind one. 600, going twice. Her breath caught in her throat. Somewhere at the very back of the hall, a door opened. Elena barely noticed it at first, too consumed by the sound of her own pulse pounding in her ears. But then she saw the heads in the room begin to turn, one after another, like a wave moving backward through the crowd. Whispers followed, quiet at first, then louder, spreading from row to row. Is that the Duke of Crestmoor? It cannot be. He never leaves that estate. I heard he hasn't stepped foot in London in 3 years. Elena turned her head, following the direction of every gaze, and saw a tall man standing just inside the doorway. He wore a long black coat that made him look taller than he already was, and his dark hair was slightly windblown, as if he had walked here quickly, without the patience to wait for a carriage to be properly announced. His face was striking, sharp-jawed and serious, with eyes that scanned the room once, coolly, before settling directly on her. Elena had never seen him before in her life, but something about the way he looked at her made her stomach tighten in a way that was entirely different from the fear she had felt moments before. Pratt cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard. Your Grace, we were not expecting you. The Duke did not answer him. He walked forward, unhurried, his boots echoing against the wooden floor with a steady, deliberate rhythm that somehow silenced the entire room faster than any gavel could have. He stopped near the front, not far from where Holloway sat, and Elena watched Holloway's smug expression falter slightly as the Duke's shadow fell across him. I believe the bid currently stands at 600, the Duke said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to command a room. "It does, Your Grace," Pratt said carefully. 1200, the Duke said. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Elena's lips parted in shock. She heard Holloway sputter something behind her, though she could not make out the words over the sudden roar of whispered conversation that broke out around them. Pratt looked between the Duke and Holloway, his eyes wide behind his small glasses, clearly unsure how to handle a bid that had just doubled the previous one without hesitation. £1,200 from His Grace, the Duke of Crestmoor, he announced, his voice slightly unsteady now. Holloway's face had gone red for an entirely different reason now. He glanced toward the Duke, opened his mouth as if to raise the bid again, then seemed to think better of it. Whatever reputation the Duke of Crestmoor carried, it was apparently enough to make even a man as confident as Holloway hesitate. "Going once," Pratt said. Elena's eyes remained locked on the Duke, who had not looked away from her since the moment he entered the room. She could not understand why a man she had never met would spend such an enormous sum on a stranger, and the not knowing terrified her almost as much as the auction itself had. Going twice. Holloway shifted in his seat, glancing around the room as if hoping someone else might rescue him from the embarrassment of losing, but no one moved. "Sold," Pratt said, striking the gavel again. "To His Grace, the Duke of Crestmoor." The sound rang through the hall, final and absolute, and Elena felt the platform beneath her feet seem to tilt, though she had not actually moved at all. In the space of a single word, her fate had shifted from one stranger's hands to another's. She did not know if she had just been saved, or simply purchased by someone far more dangerous than Holloway could ever have been. The Duke walked toward the platform without a single word to anyone else in the room. Pratt scrambled forward with a stack of papers, murmuring something about signatures and legal transfer of debt, but the Duke barely glanced at them, signing quickly with a pen produced from his own coat pocket, as though he had come prepared for exactly this outcome. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at Elena, close enough now that she could see the color of his eyes, a deep, storm-colored gray that gave away absolutely nothing of what he was thinking. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her, "you are free to leave this room. Whether you choose to walk out beside me or not, that part is yours to decide." Elena stared at him, stunned into silence. No one in this entire building had offered her a choice about anything since the moment her mother's debt had been revealed. She glanced past him at the rows of watching faces, at Pratt still holding his papers, at Holloway glaring from his seat with open resentment. She thought of the house she had lost. She thought of the mother she was still mourning. She thought of the strange, quiet certainty in the Duke's eyes, so different from the hunger she had seen in every other man's expression in that room. She did not know if she could trust him, but she knew, with complete certainty, that she could not stay in that building a moment longer. "I will walk out beside you," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the Duke's expression, though it vanished before she could name it. He offered his arm, and after a brief hesitation, Elena placed her hand upon it. Together they walked out of the auction hall, past Pratt's uncertain gaze, past Holloway's furious stare, past dozens of watching strangers, who would no doubt spend the rest of the evening talking about what they had just witnessed. Outside, the evening air was cold and sharp against Elena's skin, and for the first time in weeks, she felt herself breathe fully, though she had no idea what waited for her beyond those doors. A carriage stood ready at the curb, black and unmarked except for a small crest on the door, a wolf standing beneath a crescent moon. The Duke opened the door himself, without waiting for a footman, and helped Elena inside before climbing in after her and settling into the seat across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The carriage began to move, the city passing by in a blur of lantern light and shadow through the small window beside her. Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for some clue as to what kind of man had just spent £1,200 on a woman he had never met. But his expression remained unreadable, calm and distant, as though the events of the last few minutes had cost him no more effort than choosing which book to read that evening. "Why did you do that?" Elena finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. The Duke turned his gaze toward the window, watching the city lights pass. "Because someone needed to," he said simply. It was not an answer, not really, but something in the quiet weight of his voice told Elena that there was far more behind those 5 words than he was willing to explain, at least not yet. The carriage rolled on into the darkening evening, carrying her toward a life she could not yet imagine, beside a man whose true intentions remained as much a mystery as the storm-colored eyes that refused to look away from her. The journey out of London took nearly 2 hours, and for most of it, Elena said nothing at all. She watched the city give way to open fields, the last scattered lights of town fading behind them, until only the moon lit the road ahead. The Duke sat across from her in silence, occasionally glancing out the window, his hands resting still on his knees, as though he had done this drive 1,000 times before and no longer needed to think about it. Elena's mind, however, would not stop racing. She turned the events of the evening over and over, trying to make sense of a man who had spent a fortune on a stranger, and then offered her nothing but silence in return. Every story she had ever heard about wealthy men buying young women at auctions like the one she had just escaped ended badly for the woman involved. She braced herself, quietly, for whatever came next, promising herself that whatever happened, she would not let this man see her break. "You are frightened of me," the Duke said suddenly, breaking the long silence. Elena straightened her spine. "I do not know you well enough to be frightened of you specifically. I am frightened of what tonight might mean for me." He studied her for a moment, something almost like respect flickering across his features. "A fair answer," he said. "Let me offer you a fact that may ease your mind, even if only slightly. I have no interest in forcing anything upon you, Miss Whitmore. Not your hand, not your company, not your gratitude." "Then why buy me at all?" Elena asked, unable to keep the sharpness from her voice. "Men do not spend £1,200 out of simple kindness." "No," he agreed. "They rarely do." "Then tell me plainly," Elena said, folding her hands tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Are you expecting a wife from this arrangement? A companion? Something else entirely? I would rather know now, however unpleasant the answer, than spend the coming days guessing at your intentions." The Duke's gaze remained steady on hers, and for a moment she thought she saw something like sadness pass behind his eyes. "I am expecting nothing from you, Miss Whitmore, beyond your presence under my roof. While certain matters are resolved, you will not be asked to marry me. You will not be asked to warm my bed, or entertain my guests, or perform any duty you do not freely choose. My household staff will treat you as an honored guest, not as a servant, and not as property. That much I can promise you tonight, even if I cannot yet explain everything else." "That is a great deal of promise from a man who will not explain his reasons," Elena said, though some of the sharpness had left her voice. "I understand your suspicion," the Duke replied. "In your position, I imagine I would feel the very same. I ask only that you allow me a little time before I lay out the full truth. There are matters still uncertain, pieces I do not yet wish to share until I have confirmed them properly. I would rather give you facts than speculation." He offered nothing further, and Elena felt frustration rise in her chest, hot and immediate. She wanted to press him, to demand a real answer, but something about the tight set of his jaw told her that pushing further would earn her nothing but more silence. So instead, she turned her attention back to the window, watching the dark shapes of trees rush past, and let the questions simmer quietly within her. Eventually, the carriage began to slow, and Elena leaned forward slightly to see out the window. Ahead of them, rising out of the darkness like something from an old story, stood Crestmoor Manor. It was enormous, far larger than she had imagined, its stone walls pale under the moonlight, dozens of tall windows reflecting the glow of scattered lanterns along the drive. Towers rose at each corner of the building, and thick ivy climbed one entire wing, giving the estate an air of both grandeur and quiet neglect, as though parts of it had not been touched by loving hands in a very long time. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the main entrance, and a footman hurried forward to open the door. The Duke stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand to help Elena down. She hesitated only a moment before accepting it, her fingers brushing against his gloved palm as she stepped onto the gravel drive. Up close, the manor was even more overwhelming. The front doors alone stood twice her height, carved from dark wood and set with iron fittings shaped like climbing vines. A woman stood waiting just inside the entrance, dressed in a neat gray gown with a ring of keys hanging from her waist. She had a kind, weathered face and sharp eyes that studied Elena with open curiosity, though not unkindly. "Mrs. Fenwick," the Duke said, "this is Miss Elena Whitmore. She will be staying with us. See that she is given the blue room in the east wing, and that anything she requires is provided without delay." Mrs. Fenwick dipped into a small curtsy. "Of course, Your Grace. Welcome to Crestmoor, Miss Whitmore." Elena managed a small nod, still too overwhelmed by the sheer size of the house to form a proper reply. The Duke did not linger. He excused himself with a brief bow of his head, stating only that he had matters to attend to, and disappeared down a long corridor without another word, leaving Elena alone with the housekeeper in the vast, echoing entrance hall. "Come along, dear," Mrs. Fenwick said gently, noticing the way Elena's eyes darted nervously around the space. "You must be exhausted. Let us get you settled, and you can ask all the questions you like once you have had a proper meal and a good night's rest." Elena followed her through a maze of hallways, each one lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. The house was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Occasionally, they passed a maid or footman who offered a polite nod before hurrying on about their duties, but the overall atmosphere of the manor was one of solemn, careful stillness. "Has the Duke always lived alone here?" Elena asked, unable to stop herself. Mrs. Fenwick's expression flickered, just slightly. "For a good many years now, yes, since before I came into service here myself." "Is there a reason for that?" The housekeeper's steps slowed, and for a moment Elena thought she might actually answer. But then Mrs. Fenwick simply shook her head. "That is not really my story to tell, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps in time His Grace will share it with you himself. For now, let us focus on getting you settled." They arrived at a large door near the end of a quiet corridor, and Mrs. Fenwick pushed it open to reveal a spacious bedroom decorated in soft shades of blue and cream. A fire had already been lit in the hearth, casting warm light across a large four-poster bed and a writing desk positioned near the window. It was, without question, the finest room Elena had ever set foot in. "This is to be my room?" Elena asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "It is," Mrs. Fenwick confirmed. "His Grace was very specific about your comfort. A hot meal will be brought up shortly, along with water for washing. If you require anything else, simply pull the bell rope by the door, and someone will attend to you." Elena stepped further into the room, running her fingers along the edge of the writing desk, still struggling to reconcile the coldness of the auction hall with the warmth of this unexpected sanctuary. "Why is he doing this?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to the housekeeper. But Mrs. Fenwick, it seemed, had sharp ears despite her age. "I could not say for certain, Miss Whitmore. His Grace does not often explain himself, not even to those of us who have served this family for years. But I will tell you this much. In all my time at Crestmoor, I have never once seen him show this kind of interest in another person's welfare. Make of that what you will." With that, the housekeeper offered a final small smile and excused herself, leaving Elena alone in the quiet, firelit room. Elena sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft blankets, still trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a single evening. Only hours ago, she had stood on an auction platform, prepared to be handed over to a stranger like a piece of property, her future decided entirely by men who saw her as nothing more than a debt to be settled. Now she sat in a room finer than anything she had ever known, in a house belonging to a man who had spent a fortune to remove her from that fate, and yet offered her no explanation for why. A soft knock came at the door, and a young maid entered carrying a tray of food, setting it carefully on the small table near the fire. She was perhaps a year or two younger than Elena, with warm brown eyes and a friendly, open face. "I'm Nora, miss," the maid said with a small curtsy. "If you need anything at all, you've only to ask." "Thank you, Nora," Elena said, managing a small, tired smile. Nora hesitated near the door, glancing back at Elena with obvious curiosity. "Forgive me for asking, miss, but is it true that His Grace bought your debt at an auction tonight?" Elena's cheeks warmed, though she could hardly blame the girl for asking. No doubt the entire staff was already whispering about the strange arrival of a new guest under such unusual circumstances. "It is true," Elena admitted quietly. Nora's expression softened with something like sympathy. "That must have been terrifying, miss. I am glad His Grace was there. Whatever else people say about him, he is not a cruel man. Strange, perhaps. Guarded, certainly, but not cruel." "What do people say about him?" Elena asked, unable to resist the question. Nora glanced toward the door, as if checking to be sure no one else was listening, then lowered her voice. "There was a scandal, miss, some years back, before I came to work here. Something involving a broken engagement and a great deal of heartbreak. He left London society entirely after that and has hardly set foot outside Crestmoor since. Some of the older staff say he has not smiled properly in years." Elena thought of the Duke's unreadable expression in the carriage, the careful distance he had kept even while offering her kindness she had not expected. Whatever pain lived behind those storm-colored eyes, it seemed to run deep enough to keep even his own household at arm's length. "Thank you for telling me, Nora," Elena said softly. "Of course, miss. Try to eat something and get some rest. Things always look less frightening in the morning light." Nora offered one last warm smile before slipping quietly out of the room, closing the door gently behind her. Elena remained seated on the edge of the bed for a long while after the maid had gone, staring into the flickering firelight. She thought of her mother, of the house they had lost, of the frightening uncertainty of the auction hall, and of the strange, quiet man who had pulled her from that fate without asking for a single thing in return, at least not yet. She did not know what waited for her at Crestmoor Manor. She did not know whether the kindness she had been shown tonight was genuine, or simply the opening move in a much longer, more complicated game. But for the first time in weeks, lying back against the soft pillows as the fire crackled quietly in the hearth, Elena allowed herself to close her eyes, without the crushing weight of fear pressing down upon her chest. Whatever came next, she would face it with open eyes, but tonight, at least, she was safe. Morning light poured through the tall windows of the blue room, waking Elena gently, rather than with the harsh jolt she had grown used to during the long weeks following her mother's death. For a moment, she simply lay still, watching dust drift lazily through the sunbeams, allowing herself to forget, just briefly, the strangeness of her new circumstances. Then memory returned all at once, and she sat up quickly, glancing around the unfamiliar room as the events of the previous night settled back over her like a heavy cloak. The auction, the Duke's unexpected bid, the long carriage ride to Crestmoor. It had not been a dream. A soft knock sounded at the door before Nora entered, carrying a fresh basin of water and a simple but elegant blue day dress draped over one arm. "Good morning, miss. I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Elena admitted, rubbing the last traces of sleep from her eyes. "His Grace has already gone out to see to estate matters, but he asked that you be made comfortable and given free run of the house should you wish to explore," Nora said, setting the basin down carefully. "Mrs. Fenwick also mentioned that breakfast is being kept warm for you whenever you are ready." Free run of the house. Elena turned the phrase over in her mind as Nora helped her dress, still trying to understand a man who would purchase a woman's debt one evening, and then hand her the keys to his home the very next morning, all without a single demand in return. It made no sense, not according to anything she had ever heard about wealthy men, and the women whose lives became entangled with theirs. After a quiet breakfast in a bright, sunlit dining room, Elena decided to take Nora's suggestion and explore the manor. Crestmoor was even larger than it had appeared the night before, a sprawling maze of corridors, sitting rooms, and galleries, each one seemingly older and more ornate than the last. She wandered slowly, admiring tall bookshelves crammed with leather-bound volumes, delicate porcelain displayed behind glass cabinets, and enormous oil paintings depicting long-dead members of the Vane family staring solemnly down from their gilded frames. Eventually, her path led her to a long gallery lined with portraits, each labeled with a small brass plate bearing a name and a set of dates. She moved slowly along the row, studying the faces of dukes and duchesses long since passed, until she stopped in front of one portrait near the end. It depicted a young woman with golden hair and a soft, gentle smile, dressed in a pale green gown that seemed slightly out of fashion by current standards, suggesting the painting was perhaps 10 years old. Unlike the other portraits, which bore neat brass plates with clear identification, this one had no plate at all, just a faint discoloration on the wood where something had once been mounted, then removed. "That painting troubles most people who see it," came a voice from behind her, and Elena startled, turning quickly to find Mrs. Fenwick standing nearby, a stack of folded linens in her arms. "Who is she?" Elena asked, glancing back at the golden-haired woman in the portrait. Mrs. Fenwick's expression grew guarded. "That, Miss Whitmore, is a question best left for His Grace to answer, should he ever choose to." "Nora mentioned something about a broken engagement," Elena said carefully, watching the housekeeper's reaction. Something flickered across Mrs. Fenwick's face, quickly hidden. "The girl gossips too freely for her own good," she said, though there was no real anger in her voice. "I will only say this, Miss Whitmore, whatever happened between His Grace and that young lady left a wound that is never properly healed. It is not my place to say more, and I would ask that you not press him on the matter, at least not until he offers the story himself." Elena nodded slowly, though her curiosity, if anything, had only grown stronger. "I understand." Mrs. Fenwick studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in her sharp eyes. "You know, in all the years I have managed this household, I have never seen His Grace bring a single guest to Crestmoor, let alone open his home so completely to someone he met only the night before. Whatever his reasons for bringing you here, Miss Whitmore, I believe they run deeper than simple charity." Before Elena could ask what she meant, Mrs. Fenwick offered a small, knowing smile and continued down the corridor with her stack of linens, leaving Elena alone once more, with the golden-haired woman's painted eyes staring down at her from the wall. Later that same afternoon, Elena wandered out into the gardens behind the manor, hoping the fresh air might settle the unanswered questions still turning over in her mind. The gardens at Crestmoor were vast, laid out in neat rows of hedges and late-blooming flowers, with a stone path winding down toward a small pond at the far end of the property. She had not gone far before she noticed a figure kneeling near one of the flower beds, sleeves rolled up, hands buried in the dark soil. To her surprise, it was the Duke himself, dressed far more plainly than she had yet seen him, tending to a row of white roses with the careful attention of a man who found genuine peace in the work. "I did not expect to find you here," Elena said, approaching slowly. He glanced up, seemingly unbothered by being caught in such an ordinary task. "My mother planted these roses many years ago, before she passed. I find that tending them clears my mind better than anything else I have tried." Elena knelt beside him, careful of her skirts, and studied the roses more closely. "They are beautiful. I did not take you for a man who enjoyed gardening. There is a great deal about me you do not yet know, Miss Whitmore," he said, though there was no sharpness in the words, only quiet honesty. "Perhaps in time you will learn more of it, if you are patient enough to stay and discover it." "I am not entirely certain patience is a luxury I have been given much choice in," Elena said, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth despite herself. The Duke's lips curved slightly in response, the closest thing to genuine amusement she had yet seen from him. "Then let us call it curiosity instead. I suspect you have a great deal of that." "More than is probably wise," Elena admitted, and for a moment, kneeling together in the quiet garden with the late afternoon sun warming the soil between them, the distance that had defined their earlier conversations seemed to soften, just slightly, into something gentler and more hopeful. The days that followed settled into a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm. Elena rose each morning to a hot breakfast, spent her afternoons exploring the vast library or walking the manicured gardens behind the house, and took her evening meals alone in the grand dining room, since the Duke rarely appeared before dark, occupied with matters he never fully explained. When their paths did cross, their conversations remained brief and careful, both of them circling questions neither seemed ready to ask directly. Yet small kindnesses continued to appear, quiet and unannounced. A book she had mentioned enjoying once in passing would appear on her nightstand the following evening. When she skipped dinner one night, exhausted from a long walk through the gardens, a tray of warm soup and fresh bread was brought to her room, without her having requested it. When a sudden rainstorm kept her from returning indoors quickly enough, she found a thick woolen shawl left draped over the back of her favorite reading chair the very next day, though she had never mentioned being cold. Elena began to notice these gestures accumulating, each one small enough to seem like coincidence on its own, but together forming a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The Duke, for all his distance and silence, seemed to be paying closer attention to her comfort than any man she had ever known, including men who had claimed to care for her far more openly. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, Elena found herself wandering into an unfamiliar wing of the house, one she had not yet explored. The corridor here was narrower, the portraits fewer, and dust lay thicker on the wooden floors, suggesting this part of the manor received far less use than the rest. At the end of the hallway she came upon a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar, light spilling out from within. Curiosity overcame caution, and Elena pushed the door open gently, stepping into what appeared to be a private study. Unlike the rest of the house, which was kept immaculately clean by the attentive staff, this room bore the marks of long, undisturbed use. Papers were scattered across a large desk near the window, stacks of ledgers rose in uneven towers along one wall, and a small fire crackled quietly in the hearth, suggesting someone had been here recently. Elena knew she should leave. This was clearly not a room meant for wandering guests, but her eyes caught on a name scrawled across the top of one open ledger, and her feet carried her forward before her mind could stop them. Pratt. Her breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, scanning the page, and found it filled with careful notes, dates, and figures, all related to lending contracts issued by Josiah Pratt over the past several years. Beside several entries, someone had written small notes in tight, precise handwriting. Discrepancy. Falsified signature. Does not match original ledger. Elena's heart began to pound. She flipped to another page, and found her own family's name listed among the entries, the details of her mother's supposed debt laid out in stark black ink, alongside a small notation that made her blood run cold. Contract altered after original signing. Compare with copy held at Whitmore Estate. You should not be in here. Elena spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with something that might have been alarm. "I am sorry," Elena said quickly, stepping back from the desk. "The door was open, and I did not mean to intrude, but I saw my family's name, and You saw enough to have questions," the Duke finished for her, his voice quiet but not unkind. He stepped further into the room, closing the door softly behind him, and for a long moment simply studied her, as though weighing exactly how much to say. "Is this true?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly, despite her effort to remain composed. "Was my mother's debt falsified?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes moving briefly to the scattered papers on his desk before returning to her face. "I do not yet have proof enough to say with certainty," he said finally, "but I have suspected it for some time." "Some time?" Elena repeated, her voice sharpening with disbelief. "How long have you known about this?" "I began investigating Pratt's lending practices nearly 2 months ago," the Duke admitted. "Long before your name ever appeared in his ledgers. He has a history of manufacturing debts against vulnerable families, particularly those with land or property of value that others wish to acquire. When your mother's contract came across my desk, the pattern was unmistakable." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. "Then you knew. That night at the auction. You knew before you ever bid on me." "I suspected," the Duke corrected gently. "I did not have proof. I still do not fully. But I could not stand by and allow you to be handed over to a man like Holloway while I gathered the evidence needed to expose the truth." Elena's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the evening she had spent turning over in confusion for the past 2 weeks. "That is why you doubled the bid. Not simple kindness. You were trying to stop a crime." "Both things can be true at once," the Duke said quietly, and something in his voice, some rare crack in his usual composure, made Elena look at him more closely. "I could not undo what had already been done to your mother, nor prevent the loss of your home. But I could prevent one more injustice from being carried out against you at least." Elena sank slowly into the chair beside the desk, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "Who is behind this? If Pratt manufactured false debts, someone must have wanted our land badly enough to pay for such a scheme." The Duke's expression darkened. "That is the question I have not yet fully answered. Pratt does not act alone in matters like this. Someone with deeper pockets and higher standing typically funds these arrangements, using men like him to do the dirty work while remaining comfortably removed from any blame. I have my suspicions, but nothing concrete enough to act upon yet." "Who do you suspect?" Elena pressed. The Duke hesitated, clearly reluctant, before finally answering. "Lord Preston Ashcombe. He has expressed interest in acquiring land bordering your family's former estate for several years now, land your mother always refused to sell. It would not be the first time he has used less than honorable methods to acquire what he wants." Elena absorbed this information slowly, anger beginning to burn away some of her earlier shock. "Then, we must expose him, both of them, Pratt and this Lord Ashcombe." "It is not so simple," the Duke said, his voice gentle but firm. "Men of Ashcombe's standing are rarely brought down without irrefutable proof, and even then, the process can take months, sometimes years. I did not wish to burden you with any of this until I had something solid enough to act upon. I do not want to be protected from the truth," Elena said, meeting his eyes directly. "I want to help uncover it. This is my family's name, my mother's memory. I have as much right to see this through as you do." For the first time since she had known him, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of the Duke's mouth, brief and fleeting, but unmistakably real. "I suspected you might say something along those lines," he said quietly. "Very well, Miss Whitmore. If you are certain, then we shall pursue this matter together." Elena felt something shift between them in that moment, a fragile but genuine understanding, beginning to take root where suspicion and distance had stood before. Whatever walls the Duke had built around himself over the years, whatever pain still lingered from the story hidden behind the portrait of the golden-haired woman in the gallery, she sensed that a small crack had just opened, allowing her the first real glimpse of the man beneath the careful, guarded exterior. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling me the truth." "You deserve to know it," he replied simply. "And Miss Whitmore, for what it is worth, I am sorry for the pain this has already caused you and your mother's memory. Whatever happened before I became involved, I intend to see it corrected." Elena studied him for a long moment, this quiet, guarded man who had upended her entire world in the space of a single evening, and found herself, quite unexpectedly, beginning to trust him. Not completely, not yet, but enough to believe that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. Outside the study window, the afternoon light had begun to shift toward evening, casting long golden shadows across the cluttered desk between them. Somewhere beyond the walls of Crestmoor, a conspiracy waited to be unraveled, a truth still buried beneath false signatures and manufactured debts. But for the first time since her mother's death, Elena felt something steady beginning to form beneath her feet, a sense of purpose sharper and clearer than the grief and fear that had consumed her for so many weeks. She would find out the truth. And she would not do it alone. Over the following days, Elena and the Duke worked side by side in the cluttered study, poring over ledgers, contracts, and correspondence that Pratt had likely never intended anyone to see. The Duke had gathered much of the material through a network of contacts he refused to name outright, only admitting that a few clerks within Pratt's own office had grown uneasy enough with his practices to quietly pass along copies of certain documents. "Here," Elena said one afternoon, sliding a page across the desk toward him. "Look at the date on this contract compared to the one filed with the county registrar. They do not match." The Duke leaned forward, studying the page carefully, his brow furrowing in concentration. "You are right. This copy was altered nearly a year after the original signing date. Your mother would have had no reason to suspect anything, since the registrar's copy appears untouched at first glance." "Then how did you catch the discrepancy?" Elena asked. "I did not entirely," he admitted. "It was a clerk named Mr. Whitfield who first noticed something troubling in Pratt's private files months ago, long before I ever became involved. He came to me quietly, fearing for his position should Pratt discover his suspicions. I have been building on what he uncovered ever since." Elena studied the Duke's face as he spoke, noticing the careful, controlled way he discussed his own involvement, as though reluctant to claim too much credit for uncovering a wrong that had already cost her family everything. "Why did you take this on at all?" she asked quietly. "You did not know my family. You had no reason to involve yourself in Pratt's schemes before my mother's contract crossed your desk." The Duke set down the page he had been examining, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to her. "Because I have seen what schemes like this can do to a family, Miss Whitmore. I have seen the damage they leave behind, long after the debt itself has been settled." Something in his voice, quiet and heavy, told Elena this was not simple sympathy speaking. "This has happened before," she said slowly. "To someone you knew." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, and Elena thought perhaps he would refuse to answer, as he had every other time the subject of his past had come dangerously close to the surface. But this time, he did not turn away. "Her name was Charlotte," he said finally, his voice low. "We were engaged several years ago. Her family, much like yours, fell into debt through no fault of their own, manipulated by men who saw an opportunity to seize their land through manufactured contracts and false signatures. I was young, and I did not understand the situation quickly enough to intervene before the damage had already been done." Elena's chest tightened with sudden understanding. The portrait in the gallery, the woman with no name on her plate. The Duke nodded slowly. Charlotte's family lost everything, and in the end, so did she. The strain of it all broke something in her that never properly healed. She died less than a year after our engagement ended, and I have spent every year since then believing I should have seen the danger sooner, should have acted faster, should have done something, anything, differently. "That is why you left society," Elena said softly, pieces of the story the servants had whispered finally clicking into place. "Why you shut yourself away here at Crestmoor." "Guilt is a difficult companion to explain to others," the Duke admitted, something raw and unguarded in his voice for the first time since Elena had met him. "It seemed easier, for a long time, to simply avoid situations where I might fail someone the way I failed her." Elena reached across the desk, hesitating only a moment before resting her hand gently over his. "You did not fail her, Your Grace. Men like Pratt, and whoever stands behind him, they are the ones responsible for that failure, not you." The Duke looked down at her hand covering his, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. "When your mother's contract crossed my desk," he said quietly, "and I recognized the same pattern I had seen destroy Charlotte's family, I could not simply look away again. Not this time." "So you saved me not just because it was right," Elena said slowly, understanding dawning, "but because you could not bear to fail another woman the way you believed you failed her." "Perhaps," the Duke admitted. "Though I will say this, Miss Whitmore. Whatever began as an attempt to correct a past failure has become something rather different over these past 2 weeks. I find myself far more concerned with your well-being specifically than with any lingering guilt over Charlotte's memory." Elena's cheeks warmed at the quiet admission, and she withdrew her hand slowly, though the warmth of his beneath hers lingered in her memory far longer than she expected. "We should return to the ledgers," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "If we are to expose Ashcombe and Pratt, we need enough proof to make the accusation impossible to ignore." The Duke nodded, though something in his expression suggested he too felt the shift that had just occurred between them, however much neither of them was ready to name it directly. They worked late into the evening, and over the following days, the picture grew steadily clearer. Contract after contract revealed the same pattern: families with valuable land, debts manufactured or exaggerated through altered paperwork, and properties quietly transferred, often at a fraction of their true worth, into the hands of buyers connected to Lord Preston Ashcombe. Elena's family had simply been the latest in a long line of victims, though perhaps, thanks to the Duke's intervention, they would be the last. "We have enough," the Duke said one evening, gathering the most damning documents into a neat stack. "Enough to bring formal charges against Pratt, and enough circumstantial evidence to force a public inquiry into Ashcombe's involvement, even if he has been careful enough to keep his own name off the actual paperwork." "What happens now?" Elena asked, watching him carefully. "Now we confront them," the Duke said, "publicly, and with enough witnesses present that neither of them will be able to simply bury the matter through influence or bribery, as men like them so often manage to do." Before they could move forward with any confrontation, the Duke insisted on one final step: a visit to Mr. Whitfield, the clerk who had first uncovered the irregularities in Pratt's ledgers. They traveled into London under the cover of early morning, meeting the nervous, thin-faced clerk in a quiet coffee house far from Pratt's usual haunts. "I have said all I dare say in writing, Your Grace," Whitfield murmured, glancing anxiously toward the door each time it opened, "but I will tell you plainly, in person, that Lord Ashcombe's man visited Pratt's office no fewer than 6 times in the month before the Whitmore contract was altered. I saw the visitor's ledger myself before it was conveniently misplaced. Would you be willing to state that under oath, should it come to a formal inquiry?" the Duke asked quietly. Whitfield hesitated, wringing his hands beneath the table. "I have a wife and 2 young children, Your Grace. I fear what a man like Ashcombe might do to a person who crosses him." "I will see that you and your family are protected," the Duke said, his voice firm and certain. "You have my word on that, and my word is not given lightly." Something in the steady conviction of his promise seemed to settle the clerk's nerves, and after a long moment, Whitfield nodded. "Then yes, Your Grace. I will testify to what I saw and heard." Elena watched this exchange with quiet admiration, understanding more clearly with each passing day that the Duke's quiet authority was not built on wealth or title alone, but on a rare, unwavering sense of responsibility toward those he chose to protect. With Whitfield's testimony secured alongside the documents already gathered, the Duke declared the evidence sufficient to move forward. Elena felt a flicker of nervousness at the thought, but beneath it, something stronger burned steadily, a fierce determination to see her mother's name cleared, and the truth finally brought into the light. "I want to be there," she said firmly, "when you confront them. This is my family's honor at stake. I will not hide away while it is decided by others." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Elena half expected him to argue, to insist that she remain safely at Crestmoor, while he handled the confrontation alone. Instead, something like admiration flickered across his features. "I would not have expected anything less from you, Miss Whitmore. Very well. We shall face them together." That night, after the candles had burned low and the study had finally fallen quiet, Elena lay awake in her room, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, her mind turning over everything she had learned. The Duke's confession about Charlotte had changed something fundamental in how she understood him. He was not simply a distant, guarded nobleman hiding behind wealth and cold civility. He was a man carrying years of quiet grief and guilt, doing everything in his power to prevent another woman from suffering the fate he had failed to stop before. She thought of the way his hand had felt beneath hers, warm, despite the coolness of his usual manner, and of the raw honesty in his voice as he spoke of Charlotte's memory. Whatever had begun as a business arrangement to settle her mother's debt had shifted into something far more complicated, something Elena was no longer certain she wanted to resist. A soft knock came at her door, and Elena sat up, surprised to find the Duke himself standing in the doorway when she called for whoever it was to enter. "Forgive the late hour," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow, in case tonight was the only chance I had to say it properly." "Say what?" Elena asked, drawing her shawl more closely around her shoulders as she rose from the bed. The Duke stepped further into the room, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the outcome of our confrontation with Pratt and Ashcombe, I do not regret bringing you here, not for a single moment. What began as an attempt to correct a wrong has become something I value far beyond the settling of any debt." Elena's heart pounded steadily in her chest as she studied his face in the soft candlelight. "Are you saying, Your Grace, that your feelings toward me have changed since that night at the auction?" "I am saying," the Duke replied carefully, "that I find myself thinking of you constantly, worrying for your safety, hoping for your happiness, in ways I have not allowed myself to feel for anyone since Charlotte. I did not expect this. I am not entirely certain what to do with it, but I did not wish to face tomorrow without you knowing the truth of it." Elena felt something warm and fragile bloom in her chest, entirely separate from the fear and uncertainty that had defined so much of the past 2 weeks. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "I find that my own feelings have shifted a great deal since that night as well." A rare, genuine smile touched the Duke's lips, brief but unmistakably real. "Then let us face tomorrow together, Miss Whitmore, and settle this matter once and for all, so that whatever comes next between us may begin free of Pratt's shadow and Ashcomb's schemes." "Together," Elena agreed, and as the Duke bid her good night and closed the door softly behind him, she remained standing in the quiet candlelight for a long while, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The following morning arrived cold and bright, with a sharp autumn wind sweeping across the grounds of Crestmoor as the carriage was prepared for the journey into London. Elena dressed carefully, choosing a deep green gown that Mrs. Fenwick had quietly set aside for her, one that made her feel, for the first time in weeks, less like a woman being carried along by events beyond her control, and more like someone stepping forward to claim her own future. The Duke met her in the entrance hall, dressed formally in dark blue, a leather satchel containing the gathered evidence tucked beneath one arm. His expression was calm, composed, though Elena had come to recognize the small signs of tension he carried beneath that careful exterior, the slight tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw set firmly when he was preparing himself for a difficult task. "Are you certain you wish to come?" he asked one final time, though there was no real doubt in his voice, only quiet concern for her well-being. "I have never been more certain of anything," Elena replied, and together they climbed into the waiting carriage. The journey passed largely in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the countryside gave way once more to the crowded streets of London. Their destination was not Pratt's private auction hall this time, but a grand townhouse belonging to Lord Preston Ashcombe, where the Duke had arranged, through careful correspondence, a meeting under the guise of discussing a business matter related to shared property boundaries. "He does not yet know what we intend to reveal," the Duke explained as the carriage rolled to a stop outside the impressive stone building. "Pratt has also been summoned, believing this to be a routine matter concerning outstanding contracts. Neither of them expects what is about to happen." A footman led them into a richly furnished sitting room, where Lord Ashcombe himself rose to greet them, a tall, silver-haired man with sharp, calculating eyes and a smile that did not quite reach them. Pratt stood nearby, looking noticeably uneasy at the sight of Elena entering the room alongside the Duke. "Your Grace," Ashcombe said smoothly, extending a hand that the Duke did not accept. "And Miss Whitmore, is it? What an unexpected pleasure. I confess I was not aware this meeting would include additional guests." "There is much about today's meeting that will prove unexpected, Lord Ashcombe," the Duke replied evenly, setting his leather satchel down on a nearby table with deliberate care. "I believe it is time we discussed the true nature of Josiah Pratt's lending practices, and your own involvement in acquiring land from families driven into false debt." The color drained rapidly from Ashcombe's face, though he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded strained even to Elena's ears. "I have no idea what you mean, Your Grace. Whatever quarrel you have with Mr. Pratt's business dealings is hardly a matter that concerns me." "Is that so?" the Duke asked calmly, opening the satchel and beginning to lay out documents across the table, one by one. "Then perhaps you can explain why every property seized through Pratt's manufactured debts over the past 5 years has, without exception, been sold shortly afterward to buyers with direct financial ties to your own estate." Pratt had gone pale as well, his eyes darting nervously between the Duke and Ashcombe, clearly torn between loyalty to the man who had presumably been paying him handsomely for his services and simple self-preservation. "These documents prove nothing," Ashcombe said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Contracts change hands regularly. There is nothing unlawful in purchasing land from willing sellers." "Willing sellers," Elena said, unable to remain silent any longer, stepping forward beside the Duke. "My mother did not willingly sell anything, Lord Ashcombe. She was driven to despair by a debt that never should have existed, manufactured through a contract altered nearly a full year after she originally signed it. I imagine, if we examined the histories of every family listed in Mr. Pratt's ledgers, we would find the very same pattern repeated again and again." Ashcombe's composed mask finally began to crack, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features before he forced it back down. "You understand nothing of business, girl. Families like yours cling to land they cannot properly maintain, while men of vision, men willing to invest and improve, are left waiting for opportunities that never come through honest means. I did what was necessary. You committed fraud," the Duke said flatly, "and you drove desperate families to ruin in the process, all to satisfy your own ambitions. That is not vision, Lord Ashcombe. That is theft, dressed up in expensive clothing." Pratt, sensing the situation rapidly spiraling beyond his control, took a hesitant step backward toward the door. I had no part in deciding which families to target, he said quickly, his voice trembling. I merely handled the paperwork as instructed. Lord Ashcombe provided the names, the properties, and the funds necessary to make the arrangements appear legitimate. Pratt, Ashcombe snapped, his composure fully abandoned now. Hold your tongue. I have held it long enough, Pratt said, though he still would not quite meet anyone's eyes. I want no part of whatever punishment is coming for this, Your Grace. I will testify to everything, provided some leniency is shown regarding my own role in the matter. The Duke's expression remained cold and controlled, though Elena thought she detected a flicker of satisfaction beneath the surface. Your cooperation will be noted, Mr. Pratt, and considered when the matter comes before the proper authorities. I make no promises beyond that. Ashcombe's face had turned a dangerous shade of red, his earlier composure completely abandoned. You cannot simply walk into my home and destroy my reputation on the word of a moneylender and a debt-ridden orphan, he snarled, all pretense of civility gone now. I am not relying solely on their word, Lord Ashcombe, the Duke said calmly, gesturing toward the documents spread across the table. I have gathered signed testimonies from 3 separate clerks within Pratt's office, financial records tracing every falsified contract directly back to accounts connected with your estate, and copies of correspondence between yourself and Pratt discussing specific families to target, including the Whitmore estate by name. This is no longer a matter of word against word. This is documented, provable fraud, and it will be presented before the appropriate magistrates within the week. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Ashcombe's eyes darted toward the door, toward the window, as though searching for some means of escape from a situation that had clearly slipped entirely beyond his control. What do you want? He finally asked, his voice low and bitter. Money, land, name your price, and let us settle this quietly, as men of standing should. I want justice for every family you and Pratt have destroyed through your schemes, the Duke said, his voice steady and unyielding. I want the Whitmore name cleared publicly, the false debt formally dissolved, and every improperly seized property returned to its rightful owners, wherever that remains possible. And I want you to answer for your crimes before the same magistrates who oversee matters of fraud for men of far lesser standing than yourself. Ashcombe's jaw clenched, fury and desperation warring visibly across his features, but he seemed to understand, finally, that no amount of bluster or bribery would extract him from the situation the Duke had so carefully constructed. You have ruined me, he said quietly, the fight suddenly draining from his voice. You ruined yourself, Lord Ashcombe, Elena said, meeting his gaze steadily. The moment you decided that other people's homes and futures were simply obstacles to be removed for your own gain. The weeks that followed unfolded quickly, though not without their share of difficulty. True to the Duke's warning, the matter was brought before the proper magistrates, and though Ashcombe attempted to leverage what remained of his influence to delay or dismiss the charges, the sheer volume of documented evidence made any true escape impossible. Pratt's testimony, offered in exchange for a reduced sentence, proved instrumental in confirming the full scope of the scheme, revealing that Elena's family had been far from the only victims of Ashcombe's greed. Lord Preston Ashcombe was stripped of his standing within polite society, his estate seized to help repay the families he had wronged, and he was ultimately sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment for fraud on a scale that shocked even the most jaded observers of London's aristocracy. Josiah Pratt, though shown some leniency for his cooperation, lost his license to conduct any further lending business, and was ordered to personally return a portion of the wealth he had accumulated through years of manufactured debts. For Elena, the most important outcome came in the form of a formal declaration, publicly announced and recorded, that the debt attributed to her mother had been entirely falsified. The Whitmore name, tarnished by weeks of scandal and suspicion, was fully restored, and while the family home itself could not be reclaimed, having already changed hands multiple times before the fraud was uncovered, Elena found that the restoration of her mother's honor mattered to her far more than the physical property ever could. On a quiet afternoon several weeks after the confrontation with Ashcombe, Elena stood once more in the gallery at Crestmoor, studying the portrait of the golden-haired woman with no name upon her plate. She heard soft footsteps approaching, and turned to find the Duke standing beside her, his expression thoughtful as he too studied the painting. I have decided to have a proper plate made for her portrait, he said quietly. Charlotte deserves to be remembered by name, not hidden away as though her memory were something shameful. Elena smiled softly, understanding the significance of this small but meaningful decision. I think that is a beautiful choice, Your Grace. Alistair, he said gently, I believe after everything we have faced together, You may finally call me by my given name. Alistair, Elena repeated softly, testing the sound of it, finding that she liked the way it felt. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment before Alistair turned to face her fully, something both nervous and hopeful in his storm-colored eyes. Elena, the debt that first brought you to Crestmoor has been fully settled. Your family's name has been restored. You are, in every sense, entirely free. Free to leave this house, to build whatever life you wish, without any further obligation to me or to anyone else. Elena's heart began to pound, sensing the weight behind his words. And if I do not wish to leave? She asked softly. A rare, unguarded smile broke across Alistair's face, warmer and more genuine than anything Elena had seen from him since the night they first met. Then I would consider myself the most fortunate man in England, he said, reaching out to gently take her hand in his. Elena, these past weeks have shown me something I never expected to feel again after Charlotte. You have brought light into rooms of this house that have remained dark for years, and into corners of my own heart I believed had closed permanently. I do not ask you to stay out of any remaining debt or obligation. I ask you to stay because I love you, entirely and without reservation, and because I hope, in time, you might come to feel the same toward me. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, though for the first time in months, they were tears born entirely of happiness, rather than grief or fear. I already do feel the same, Alistair, she admitted softly. Somewhere between that terrifying auction hall and these quiet weeks at Crestmoor, I fell in love with a man far kinder and more honorable than I ever could have imagined when you first doubled that bid. Alistair raised her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. Then let us begin properly, Elena Whitmore, not as a transaction settled through debt and desperation, but as two people who have chosen each other freely, with open hearts and honest intentions. I would like that very much, Elena whispered, and as Alistair drew her gently into his arms beneath the watchful, painted eyes of Charlotte's portrait, Elena felt, for the first time since her mother's death, that she had finally found not just safety, but a true and lasting home. In the months that followed, their engagement was announced not with the cold formality of a business arrangement, but with genuine joy that surprised even the most skeptical members of London society, who had long assumed the reclusive Duke of Crestmoor would never open his heart again. Mrs. Fenwick wept happy tears when the news was shared with the household staff. Nora could hardly contain her excitement, and even the portrait gallery seemed, in Elena's imagination, to hold a lighter, warmer air than it had upon her first arrival. The debt that had once threatened to destroy Elena's future had instead led her, through fear and uncertainty, discovery and quiet courage, to a love she never could have anticipated. What began as a transaction born of desperation had transformed, slowly and honestly, into a partnership built on trust, shared purpose, and genuine affection, proving that even the darkest beginnings could, with patience and courage, lead toward a future brighter than either of them had dared to imagine. And as the autumn light faded gently over the towers of Crestmoor Manor that evening, Elena Whitmore stood beside the man she loved, finally and completely free, not because a debt had been settled, but because her heart had found exactly where it belonged.